The 30-second lesson. Hard to believe. We're looking at the 100 days of Theodore Roosevelt and the first New Deal, a flurry of legislation initiated by a Congress that was sitting almost constantly for the first period of Roosevelt's reign to deal with the worst of the Depression. Now, one of the things that happens between the end of the election of 1932 and Roosevelt coming into office in March of 1933, as presidents did at that particular time, was that the economy began to decline further and faster than it had at any point between the Great Crash and the November election of 1932. This culminates in a massive banking crisis. At the beginning of March, millions of people start marching into their banks, demanding their money as they started to worry that their savings were disappearing, as the liquidity of the banks became a front page news topic. And as they were allowed, they started to demand this money back in gold. It became impossible for banks to essentially give this amount of gold over, especially considering the lineups for getting into the banks were sometimes several blocks long, as was the case in some of the famous pictures you'll see in New York City. In 34 states, banks closed and padlocked their doors. The entire financial system of the United States was seemingly on the verge of collapse as widespread panic, greater than anything that had ever seen before, gripped the nation. And in the context of that, Roosevelt steps into his first day on the job. Hoover, I'm sure, was glad to hand over the keys to the Oval Office, and in steps FDR. And his New Deal, he basically promises, as we said, to bold and persistently experiment. And he sets in right away to reform the banking system because this is the first major crisis. And basically, he says he needs to prime the pump. It's a prime the pump. That's an engineering term. In other words, you have to sort of sometimes get gas into the system before you can start the engine. And by restarting the economy and putting people back to work, he wants to do so through the creation of a social services network and support those who had fallen on hard times. So it's banking, social services, and then support. So between the 8th of March and the 16th of June, which constitutes the 100 days, ending on my birthday in 1933, not that I was born in 1933, I'm much younger than that, I'm only 21, or something to that effect. In what became known as the first 100 days, Congress began to follow Roosevelt's lead, and they passed an incredible 15 separate bills, most of which we'll talk about in this lesson, and most of which, unfortunately, you're going to need to know, which form the basis of what we understand as the first New Deal. Several of these programs, during that sort of 3.5 months of time, are still around in the federal government today and have had a long lasting impact on changing the nature of the relationship between the American government and its people. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and I'll talk about this in a little bit, used something called fireside chats. I'll come back to that in a second. But in his fourth fireside chat of June 1934, he starts to talk about his New Deal. And he said that it had three related steps. And we've got to look at the degree to which the New Deal, the first one anyway, deals with the three things he wanted to. He called them his 3 R's. They are relief, that's helping the poor and the unemployed, the recovery, getting the economy going again, and reform. That's changing things so that a depression like the one they were currently dealing with could never happen again like this. Now, as I mentioned, the fireside chats, Roosevelt takes a different tact. He begins to, in essence, sell. Roosevelt's biggest skill is not that he's a massive intellect, not that he is the person with all of the ideas. In fact, more or less, he's the salesman, and he's really hawking other people's ideas. He, as we said in the last lesson, surrounds himself with people he refers to as the brains trust. And his biggest, probably, political skill and greatest asset is to listen to those people whom are the most intelligent in their field. And in essence, Roosevelt becomes the salesman. And one of the ways he sells his message to the American people is to communicate to them like no president has ever communicated to the American public before. Hoover worked diligently in his office, not to say that Delano Roosevelt didn't, but Roosevelt begins to communicate via the new medium of radio. And in these fireside chats, he talks about certain things. Homeliness, okay? They're delivered, these chats are delivered like a father discussing public affairs with his family in the living room. People could hear the fire crackling in the background. FDR told people that he went fishing to think over the big reforms so he'd not get out of touch with ordinary people's thinking. Whether he did or didn't is really irrelevant. He told people he did, and they believed him. He seemed very reasonable. There's an essence of reasonableness in this. He said that he was not going to make false promises and he would not succeed every time. He used a baseball analogy, which if you're a fan of baseball, you'll understand, and potentially even cricket, this will make sense. He says, I do not deny that we will make mistakes. I have no expectation of making a hit every time I come to bat. And then he also laid out some blame. He took on not only the critics of the New Deal politically, the critics of the New Deal and big business, and in essence, the people who weren't affected by the Depression. He spoke of what he called the 10%. And that's an interesting sort of analogy because you hear oftentimes groups talking about the 1% today. He spoke about the 10% then who wanted the New Deal to fail. He say, these 10%ers, they can be divided into two groups. First, those who seek special political privilege, and second, those who seek financial privilege. And he really took on sort of the ivory tower of American political and financial life. And in essence, this really truly endeared Roosevelt, whether or not he succeeded with his New Deal or failed with most of the things he did. He sold the message that he was trying. Anyways, all that said, the fireside chats had the effect that ordinary people believed he was fighting the rich and the selfish on their behalf. And as a result, even though the gains of the first New Deal were not that great, FDR did win the 1936 election by yet another landslide. I'm not sure the people of Maine ever liked Roosevelt. I don't think they voted for him in 36 or 32. It's neither here nor there, but anyhow. Here's the timeline of the New Deal. Internalize it. I'm not going to walk you through it. Overview of the targets. So let's take a look at what he goes into, and we'll start breaking down what he does in each of these sections. We're going to start looking at what he does for banking and finance, which he gets on right away. Then he's going to look at regulating the stock exchange to prevent things like the great crash from happening again. He's going to look at economies and government. I'll explain that when we get to there. He's going to look at industrial recovery. He's going to look at relief, and he's going to look at housing. Now, let's start with banking. As I said, banking's in crisis. Roosevelt inherits the worst banking crisis in history. In fact, he gets elected, and it happens while Hoover's sort of in his last days in office. In America, 40 banks were closing a day on average. American banks only had $6 billion available, and there were $41 billion in deposits that people were seeking to withdraw. On taking office, FDR, in essence, closed the banks for a week. And this was a way to restore confidence, to stop that out and out panic, that run on the bank. And he summoned Congress in immediately, which Congress actually doesn't necessarily meet the first day the president comes to office. The president sets up his team, and then Congress meets in scheduled sessions. He summons Congress immediately to deal with this. And the first thing he does is declare a national bank holiday. And this was the day after his inauguration. And this wasn't to celebrate his inauguration. He declares a bank holiday to stop the run on the banks. And he closes all banks in the country, and he prevents, in essence, a collapse on the banking system. With the banks closed, Roosevelt will then take measures to restore the public's confidence in the financial system. So when the banks open a week later, the panic is over. And the first thing he does is what's known as the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And this was, again, aimed at restoring the confidence. And how does it do that? It gives the Treasury, okay, that is the sort of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the power to investigate all banks threatened with a collapse. This, in essence, reassures the American public that the money is safe in the banks rather than under their mattresses. And it worked. Raymond Morley, one of the Brains Trust, one of the key financial minds of the Brains Trust, felt that the American capitalism had been saved in 8 days. Perhaps he's overspeaking because he's a friend of Roosevelt, but perhaps it's also a bit true. Other things he does in regards to banking, and this is a big one, comes up a lot, the Glass-Steagall Act. The bank officials were not allowed to take personal loans from their own banks. Okay? This meant that people couldn't hedge on what they knew the bank was going to do. Individual bank deposits were to be insured, in other words, to guarantee that every dollar or every $100 deposited in the bank, up to a figure of $2,500, would be insured to guarantee that the people would not lose everything. Okay, and this was to be administered by a new agency, which is still with us today, known as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which ensures that in the case of failure, some people are insured. Now, the FDIC, you may have remembered it or maybe not from the 2008 crisis, had to uh, had to deal with, for instance, when Bear Stearns bank went out in 2008, they had to effectively insure the deposits of those people who lost their money in Bear Stearns. But none of these policies, I suppose, in essence, and just to walk you through this, all of the stuff in italicized is sort of my analysis of it. So that can help you sort of think about it and apply it towards questions. None of these policies were necessarily radically different from what Hoover was promising, and yet FDR was able to take credit. Some criticized FDR in many ways for not being radical enough, that perhaps he needed to ensure more deposits, or he needed to go much further by putting complete control over the banks. But requiring that state banks join the Fed in order to qualify for insurance, large banks were given more control over smaller ones. And although this is sort of anti-capitalist, it does ensure that the people, if they're putting money in their banks, are putting them at least in capable ones. In essence, it does create sort of a monopoly of large banks, but hey ho. In regards to finance, FDR really wanted to stop the flow of gold out of the country and to increase the amount of money in circulation, thus being able to raise prices. So he stopped the export of gold under license from the Treasury and prohibited the trading in currency for gold. This effectively took the USA off the gold standard. There's a conference called the London Conference in 1933 when Roosevelt effectively decides that he's going to destroy the gold standard. And all of the countries, in fact, Britain, here is an important point, Britain, France, all of these countries come off the gold standard in 1931 because they realized that having the gold standard meant that the cost of your dollar, which is fixed to how much gold you have, remains incredibly high. Now, the economic instability caused by the Great Depression meant that the governments needed to, in essence, devalue their currency in order to increase things like international trade. Hoover, or rather Roosevelt, believed that America's depression problems could only be solved at home. He wanted to devalue the dollar and basically collapsed what was a conference over the gold standard because he was unable to agree to an internationally agreed value for coal. So because he comes off the gold standard, there's no longer a fixed exchange rate for currency. Okay. One of the things, though, it didn't work. The nature of the Depression was too complex for any single measure to work, but certainly by pulling the USA off the gold standard, something it's off today, FDR attempted to do something about the incredible difficulty and expense that American goods had because of the value of the American dollar selling abroad. This helped boost to a small degree U.S. exports, predominantly in agriculture, but not to the degree required. FDR will later attempt to introduce things like more silver into coinage, something that, of course, the populists had wanted as early as the 1890s, but it had little impact beyond subsidizing the domestic silver industry. Prices could really not be raised without real economic growth. But these long-term structural issues that Roosevelt addresses are still with us today. And then today, for instance, the USA and almost every Western country is off the gold standard as a way of controlling their currency. And that's why, for instance, if you go to the United States, you pay a different price for your dollar than you would if you go to the Eurozone, for instance. Regulation of the stock exchange. A couple things he passes. The Truth in Securities Act. This one was really about stopping brokers from selling garbage stock. So basically, they had to give realistic information to the seller, and the seller had to confirm that they had both received and read the realistic information before they were allowed to purchase securities in the stock market. The Securities Act set up something known as the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, something known for us today. It was headed by Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, who would later become a Nazi sympathizer and UK ambassador, or rather American ambassador to the United Kingdom. This was a relatively highly successful system. It caught and imprisoned, for instance, Richard Whitney for embezzlement in 1938. Richard Whitney was a aircraft magnate part of the founder or half founder of the company known as Pratt and Whitney that make actually they make airplane engines, mostly for prop planes these days. It's still quite a large company. They also make elevators in America. Little known fact. Economies and government. FDR did, probably to his detriment, believe in a balanced budget. A lot of economists think that in times of economic hardship, you need to run a budget that is sort of anti-austerity, that's not blamed on balancing the budget. You need to borrow, inject money into the market, let the market recover, and then pay off those debts later on. Therefore, most of his recovery programs were self-financing. One of the great critics of Roosevelt in the first New Deal is because he wanted these programs to be self-financing, these programs don't go as far as some people think they need to, and it leads to quite a rise in opposition from both the radical left and, ironically, some people also think he goes too far, and you get the radical right. We'll talk about opposition to the New Deals in later lessons. He passes something known as the Economy Act, which, in order to balance the budget, will slash government salaries and cut the pensions of ex-soldiers, something that's very, very, very highly unpopular and leads to quite a lot of uh, uh, let's just say, stuff against him or opposition against him. One of the other major issues facing Roosevelt, and let's be frank, every other American president ever, was the problems in agriculture. But it was obviously very, very acute during the Depression. We've already learned about the problems in agriculture, the overproduction, the dust bowls, and the things. Now, he had two aims with his policies towards agriculture. His long-term aim, to end overproduction, his short-term aim, to end the farming crisis. And this is a high priority for the following reasons. Number one, 30% of the labor force worked in agriculture. If they couldn't afford to buy anything, industry is going to suffer, and America will never, in essence, recover from the Depression. So, therefore, agriculture and the farmers need to be stimulated with government intervention. Number two, there are a huge and powerful lobby in Washington, D.C. FDR's political supporters were Democrats. A lot of Democrats got their support from the rural South. And as a result, agricultural interests were overly represented in the Democratic Party, and he owed them something for getting him elected. Number three, there was something known as the Militant Farmers Holiday Association, and they, in effect, threatened American food supply by threatening farm strikes in the Midwest if sufficient action wasn't taken to give them more. The association will disrupt and the repossession of farms by banks. And this leads to bank problems later on. So there's this sort of cyclical nature of we need help or we'll destroy you. As we destroy you, other groups will say, hey, you need us to help you. And in essence, FDR is left with no choice but to get out and help the farmers. And fourthly, FDR also regarded the farmer as the backbone of the USA. He was idealistic about the farmers, as most American presidents were, whether they helped them or not. And in any ways, he took a lot of personal interest in trying to help those he believed had been left behind. And a lot of farmers, for instance, will find themselves in the CCC, which stands for the Civilian Conservation Corps, a make work project of the, let's just say, the most plain and simple style that there ever was. And we'll come to that a little bit later on. So what does he do to help the farmers? And he really does two major things. Okay, firstly, there's the extension of farm credit. The Farm Credit Administration, the FCA, was the umbrella body for various agencies dealing with lending to farmers, and it helped with the coordination and to ensure that farmers could still borrow in the spring to cover the costs that they needed to get through the summer and the planting and the harvesting season until they could actually sell their crops for money. And this ensured that farm credit didn't dry up and people didn't go bankrupt before the crops could be harvested. The other thing, and the major thing he does, is what's known as the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. I'm going to stop you for a second, and you may notice that you're getting killed by acronyms. And it's not something I mentioned in this, but one of the terms that is used quite frequently to describe the programs of the first New Deal is the creation of alphabet agencies, so named for the fact that they had huge amounts of acronyms, AAA, the FCA, the FDIC, the SEC. I can go on, and why not? The CCC, the NRA, the PWA. Are you enjoying yourself? Because it really, you do have to know these, and they're known as the alphabet agencies, and they're all called the alphabet agencies because they'll have alphabetical acronyms. You get that, right? I hope you do. If not, well, go see another teacher. They'll tell you what it's all about. Okay, so the AAA, it stands for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. It's 1929 to 33. Agricultural output fallen by 6%. Farmers aren't willing to cut back production because they do not believe that their neighbors will cut back production. It's the same thing that plagued farmers in the Gilded Age. So his aim was to increase farmers' incomes. And the AAA literally agrees to pay farmers to reduce their production, to pay farmers not to farm. Okay, and he's talking about the production of staple items, not the tiny stuff. We're talking about cotton, milk, production of poultry. Um, and this was supposed to be self-financing through a tax placed on companies that process food. So here are a couple examples of how the AAA worked. Farmers overproducing cotton. The AAA will plow under 10.5 million acres of cotton. As a result, because they reduce the supply, the price for cotton rises from 6.5 cents per pound to 10 cents per pound in 1 year. They slaughter 6 million pigs just to reduce the amount of pork on the market. Um, that is in order to raise the price that farmers can get for pork. As a result of the AAA, which is quite successful in this respect, the income of farmers overall raises from 4.5 billion to 7 billion. I sometimes think of a robber baron. I imagine like Andrew Carnegie going, only a raise of 3.5 billion. Why, I made that yesterday. But anyhow, the act was very popular with farmers, and in essence, it sort of worked. Another major alphabet agency and another major program aimed at helping the real disenfranchised part of the country was the establishment of the Tennessee Valley Authority, something that again is still with us today. And this was established in May of 1933, right in the middle of his 100 days. And it created essentially the largest public works program in any region ever created anywhere. And what he wanted to do was harness the power of the Tennessee River, which ran through 7 of the poorest United States: Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, obviously Tennessee, West Virginia. And what he wanted to do was to make the region more prosperous by getting them to produce hydroelectricity. He encouraged farmers in this region to use more efficient methods of cultivation. Therefore, some of their land could be taken by the creation of dams. He developed welfare and educational programs. He provided jobs. And he vastly improved the living standards of the people in the Tennessee Valley, not only through the make-work schemes of electrifying, but also by investing in things that will help people. So, for instance, he creates some of the largest fertilizer plants to give cheap and available fertilizer to the farmers who couldn't afford it, or the farmers who, in effect, didn't know how to use it. And what he does is he creates the demand, and then he creates the jobs in the production of fertilizer. So the TVA has multiple facets, not only the creation of a massive hydroelectricity project, which electrifies not both, I suppose, literally and figuratively, the Tennessee Valley region, but also provides jobs in associated industries for boosting the economy in probably one of the poorest areas of the United States. So why was it established? It was probably his most eye-catching and ambitious project. Okay, the TVA was established in many ways as we're not the Republicans. To counter the Republicans. The GOP, which stands for the Republican Party, it stands for the Grand Old Party, had vetoed schemes to develop the river in the 1920s. In essence, FDR was making a point that he was different than Hoover. The scheme covered impoverished states. That's another reason. It showed the Democrats cared about these poor regions. And all of these regions had been Republican in 1928, but had switched to Democratic. So in essence, FDR was repaying them for their support. And the TVA was a public body. FDR wanted to show that government agencies were able to work for the public, and that, in essence, break the belief that the government should stay out of public affairs. And he was able to show, with the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority and some of the poorest states, that the government could work for the public, not for profit, and in essence, also make areas more prosperous. It counters the fundamental belief in the American psyche that the government cannot make money. It cannot help people prosper. People have to prosper through rugged individualism and picking themselves up by the bootstraps, and the TVA goes wholeheartedly against this. Another reason and another thing that he focuses on, of course, is industrial recovery. The economy will grow by 10% a year during FDR's first term, but unemployment still remains massively, massively high. It never goes below 14%. And in fact, by the end of Roosevelt's first term, we'll be hovering again around 16, 17%, if I'm not mistaken. And his aim in this was to get people back to work again and increase consumer demand. Now, one of the things hampering industrial recovery is the fact that he couldn't get a consensus among businessmen. Some wanted more laissez-faire, someone wanted complete nationalization of some industries. So what he does is he passes something that's sort of in between. It's known as the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, passed near the end of his 100 days in June of 1933. And it had two parts. The NRA, very famous, and the PWA, also very famous. So you need to make sure you understand that sort of a hierarchy of acronyms there. Now let's go through each one of these individually. The National Recovery Administration is our first one. It's headed by General Hugh Johnson, a First World War general and war hero, someone who was known for motivating his men in the trenches of the First World War, and he's given this job for motivating the workers of America to become better at work, I suppose. Anyways, make a long story short, he sets the NRA to oversee industrial recovery. The NRA draws up 557 codes, and firms that followed these codes of practice could display the symbol of a blue eagle with the words underneath that say, "We do our part." And this was supposed to show that this is a company contributing to the ending of the Depression. If you could afford their products, you should buy it as a symbol of goodwill. I guess it's in essence, I don't know, similar but not really to, let's say, the Queen symbol, the sort of the royal warrant holder symbol, but not really. But anyways, it causes some people to buy it. I don't know. I always get stuck up. I want to buy a little bit hot sauce. The royal warrant holders. I grab myself the Macaroni Tabasco sauce because I want to support something the Queen likes. Anyway, make a long story short. Antitrust legislation was suspended for 2 years in order to encourage, let's say, predatory but industrial growth. Yellow dog clauses were put in the NRA, and these clauses were outlawed, and employees had the right to join labor unions and participate in collective bargaining. Now, the NRA is a mixture of failure and success. Many of the codes that they had people follow were unworkable because they were drawn up so quickly. Many large manufacturers like Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company doesn't even sign up to the NRA. Congress will set up a review board and found that the codes favored big business. Small firms struggled to pay the minimum wage, for instance, which was one of the codes, and the minimum wage was $11 for a 40-hour work week. That's not $11 an hour, by the way. That's $11 in total for 40 hours work. And unions complained that they weren't given enough power. Even though they were allowed to exist and they were allowed to bargain, they weren't given enough bargaining power, and that's something he'll have to address in his second New Deal. The other thing that said is there was just too much bureaucracy. It slowed things down. There was a code, for instance, for the number of performers allowed in a striptease show, which meant that, basically the government just, it's in essence stifled creativity. Anyways, the codes were voluntary. The government had no powers over business, and in essence, the NRA was seen as massive government overreach. The Supreme Court will obviously, big business will pump huge amounts of money into attacking the codes in the NRA, which they saw as way too much government overreach. And as we'll talk about later, the Supreme Court will declare the NRA unconstitutional in May 1935 and get rid of it. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, this is sometimes known as the this was a program aimed at getting people back to work through the building of, let's just say, massive public works projects. And not only have to be massive, they could be small, but there were huge numbers of them. Now, this was headed by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, a very, very effective civil servant. He was given $3.3 billion, and his purpose was to prime the pump, as I've explained earlier, and to pour huge amounts of government money into the building of things for the public to lead to economic growth, i.e., get people working, get them spending their money in the economy, and start churning up demand. Ix was an incredible administrator, actually. He was meticulous. He made sure not to waste any of the taxpayers' money that didn't need to be spent. And eventually, by both proving successful and getting people back to work, the PWA stands as a very great success of Roosevelt's 100 days. In the end, he gets hundreds of thousands of people back to work. He builds, for example, 13,000 schools. They paved 50,000 miles of road, and they created 4 national parks. I think very fondly of my time in Saratoga National Park, something created by the Public Works Administration. It's a beautiful park in northwest New York State, near the quaint village of Saratoga, home of a Revolutionary War battlefield. One time saw Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young play in the amphitheater in that park. It's one of the great moments of my life. Anyways, moving on. Thank you, Public Works Administration. Um, lastly, we get down to relief. Relief was, in essence, relief for the poor. And unlike Hoover, FDR is willing to directly involve the government in relief measures. What he creates is known as the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FARA, in May 1933. This gives $500 million to be divided amongst the states as relief to the unemployed. Make note of this, okay? FARA does not give the money to the unemployed directly. It gives it to the states to disseminate. One of the reasons for that is it had it given the money directly, it would have been considered massive government overreach, and the Supreme Court would have voted it down. That said, the government gives it to the states, which leads to all sorts of problems because the emergency relief is unequally doled out. So, for instance, in southern states, black people don't get very much, but the white people get the emergency relief. Let's just go through it, though, and we'll come to some of those problems, the New Deal, in later lessons. But you need to consider that probably star this or whatever you want to do. This is a little bit interesting. The government would also pay each state $1 for every $3 it spent in relief. So each state was to have a fair office, could raise money through taxation or borrowing, and it set an important precedent for the direct government intervention in the economy. Now, this created huge amounts of opposition. It was felt to many that the poor or being poor was that person's fault, and giving money away, in essence, was seen as anti-capitalist, communist, in fact. The governor of Oregon advocated for euthanasia for the sick and the needy rather than actually give money from the FARA funds. Nice man. Lack of funds. By 1935, though, the government started to run out of money to donate to FARA. By 1925, it was paying $25 per month to a family on relief, even though the minimum wage for subsistence was $100. And many people started to attack FARA from the other side, saying that, well, you have this relief administration, but you're not giving us enough to live on. So you can't. It was really a no-win scenario. In essence, it was a result or an example of Roosevelt's consistent experimentation and things that mean well but fail. Another example of relief is the one I alluded to earlier, known as the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, started in March of 1933. And this was for unemployed young men to work in places like national forests, parks, and public lands. People were paid to sweep the streets of Washington, D.C. Cost quite a bit of money, actually. $5.5 billion was spent on the Civilian Conservation Corps in the first year alone. Men were paid $30 a month, which is quite good. Though it's under the minimum wage, industrial workers were allowed to be paid. In its lifetime, the CCC installed more than 65,000 miles of telephone line. They planted 1.5 billion trees, and more than anything, they gave young men a job and some self-respect. However, again, this was only for white men, and there was no guarantee of a full-time job after leaving the CCC. Many men joined the CCC for a short period of time. In fact, later on, you could only enter the CCC had you been unemployed for more than, I think, 3 or 4 months, and then you could only work in that for a period of a maximum of 1 year before you had to go out and look for another job before reapplying and trying to get back on the CCC. So it was only a temporary measure, but it did get people back to work. This was something that was enormously popular with the long-term unemployed, and it showed that at least Roosevelt and the government cared. Another example is the Civil Works Administration, the CWA. This got a $400 million grant from the PWA. Are you drowning in acronyms yet? But remember the Public Works Administration. And what they did with the Civil Works Administration was they provided emergency relief to the unemployed during the winter of 33-34, the height and hardest winter of the Depression. This was closed down shortly after, but it's an example of immediate relief during a time of immediate and pressing hardship. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is housing. Okay, he wanted to stop the idea that houses were being foreclosed upon across the country. He created, firstly, the Homeowners Refinancing Corporation. This offered homeowners mortgages at low rates of interest over long periods of time. The second thing he did was the Federal Housing Administration, and this offered federal insurance to protect the ability to repay low-interest long-term mortgages. And while this was, in essence, attempt to A, keep people in their homes by offering them mortgages they could afford to repay, and B, get people back to work by building more homes by having mortgages that where people could afford to repay. Okay, but as with all things, there are limits. You can't help everyone, and the loans were solely for new purchased single-family homes. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, did nothing to help poverty-stricken inner cities, and in essence, this was a suburban project which favored, I'll be honest, the white middle class. So 65% of new houses costing over $4,000, only effectively, like I said, white middle class families could afford to take out these mortgages. So that compromise is what gets known as the First New Deal. I hope you thoroughly understand everything at this point. No, you probably don't, but you're going to have to go over this and learn it. So do so and suck it up, because I had to. So it was really harsh. Anyways, moving on. So what's the character of the First New Deal? This is important to consider. What are the motivations? One of the questions that you'll tend to ask, or definitely be asked to think about by me and others, will be, was it planned or merely a series of ad hoc measures? The New Deal was formed from the advice of many schools of thought, and as a result, it can be seen as let's just say, it doesn't come from one particular think tank. Number one, it's influenced by conservatives, okay? The director of budget, a guy named Lewis Douglas, one of the Brains Trust, believed in limited government intervention, and therefore, a lot of the First New Deal was based on short-term public works projects, CWA, for example. And he wanted to leave, broadly speaking, existing structures unaltered. So there's not a whole lot of major structural change in the First New Deal. The other one is inflationist, okay? The idea that they wanted to reduce the value of the dollar in order to encourage exports abroad. So he advocates, for instance, using silver as a legal tender. Also, he takes the USA off the gold standard, as I explained earlier. The third one, he was obviously influenced by the left side of political politics, such as the progressives. Obviously, these people want to see the breakup of giant corporations, government taking more of a result in limiting banking. So you see, like the things on securities, the things on Wall Street, the restrictions on Wall Street really come from the progressive movement. You have a guy named Felix Frankfurter, a member of the Brains Trust, that really advocates for this. Another major one comes from economic planners, a guy I'll talk about a little bit across a few lessons, a man named Rexford Tugwell. He wanted to see the government play a greater role in the central planning, and he wanted to see that essentially a structural change in the American system. And they opposed the idea of a balanced budget, believing that the government should go into debt to bring some measure of stability and economic recovery. Now, what is the First New Deal? So you have the three R's. They're relief, recovery, and reform. The First New Deal is primarily about relief and recovery, and we'll see that the Second New Deal is more about the actual reforming the system. So let's take a look at some of the relief. Federal action to relieve the unemployed, the CCC and the FRA. Federal action to relieve hardship, the AAA. Things to stabilize the banking system. Glass-Steagall Act, Trust Securities Act, Trust and Securities Act, getting off the gold standard, the Emergency Banking Relief Act, the creation of a week-long bank holiday. All of this led to some relief and to some recovery, but let's be honest, not a good deal of either. When you see that at most, 14% of America remains unemployed during this first quote-unquote New Deal. So there's still massive problems here. So what we get to see is what becomes known as the Roosevelt way. or as the Americans call it, the Roosevelt way. And this was to A, listen to a wide range of opinions, to portray himself as the savior of American capitalism, then the replacer of it, to sell the ideas. Harry Hopkins will say it's not really a clearly thought out program. There is, in essence, mostly improvisation. So the balance sheet. What the first New Deal is it's not a blueprint for radical change, certainly not on the part of the president. But I guess even if unintentional, the policies do set an important precedent. The role of the government in people's lives dramatically increases. But the first New Deal is not, and you should not argue that it's a radical reform of the American system. That will be tried next in the second New Deal, which is coincidentally our next lesson, and I look forward to seeing you then.